clear about what we're going to talk about today. Public-private partnerships can mean a great variety of things. As we developed this webinar, we chose to focus on public-private partnerships in the sense used by state DOTs and the US DOT, which is to say partnerships that involve large infrastructure projects. We hope to address the diverse ways in which the public and private sectors work together at a later date, but this webinar will be about large infrastructure projects and how the public and private sector work together in those projects and things to be aware of. And this is an Advocacy Advance webinar, which is a partnership between the Alliance for Biking and Walking and the League of American Bicyclists. I'm Ken McLeod, the legal specialist for the League of American Bicyclists, and I'll give you a short introduction before we hand it off to our three presenters today. And I'll just give it 1 or 2 minutes to let a few more people log on before we start in earnest. At any time during this webinar, if you have questions, please use the question portion of the GoToWebinar module to ask those questions. Hopefully we'll have time at the end to get those questions to our presenters, and if not, we will do our best to answer them in that module. All right, so I'm going to start the webinar in earnest. So we are talking about public-private partnerships for transportation. A little housekeeping before we get in that. I want to say thank you to our supporters at the Everybody Walk Collaborative and SRAM Cycling Fund. They make Advocacy Advance possible, and Advocacy Advance is a partnership between the Alliance for Biking and Walking and League of American Bicyclists. Advocacy Advance currently has our Big Ideas grants as a new thing that we're doing. It's modeled on our successful Rapid Response Grant program. So this is a relatively short turnaround rolling application for short-term campaigns focused on investments. This will be 3 grants of $10,000 each, and it seeks to fund innovative campaigns addressing the most pressing issues in biking and walking advocacy. The issues that we are looking for are equity-related campaigns that are about investments in previously underinvested in areas or areas that have significant economic or other social issues. Safety or Vision Zero campaigns focused on investments that address safety and bringing the total traffic deaths to 0. Health and walking campaigns focused on the health improvements that biking and walking can bring to communities, and innovative local or state funding campaigns focused on non-traditional sources of funding for biking and walking. So please check out our website if you are currently considering a campaign in any one of those areas and would like a grant of $10,000. The key goals of this webinar are to identify public interest in public-private partnerships for transportation, understand state laws that affect public-private partnerships for transportation, and learn about the multimodal aspects of US 36 in Colorado, which is a new public-private partnership in Colorado that has some great features that we think people should know more about. At some times, this webinar may sound like it is about how you get your highway or large transit facility built. Our intention is really to let you know how to react when a highway or large transit facility is proposed as a public-private partnership and give you those tools to engage in this conversation. So our speakers today are Donald Cohen, the Executive Director of In the Public Interest, which is a comprehensive resource center on privatization and responsible contracting. We have Jim Reed, the Transportation Program Director at the National Conference of State Legislatures, which is an organization committed to representing and strengthening state legislatures. And we have Will Kerns, the Transportation Planner at 36 Commuting Solutions and Open Plan Consultants. And 36 Commuting Solutions is a nonprofit membership organization of public and private sector organizations committed to advancing multimodal transportation needs in the US 36 corridor in Colorado. So what are public-private partnerships for transportation? Public-private partnerships exist when a service or responsibility usually performed by the public sector is provided by the private sector according to contract. A few years back, the Government Accountability Office put out a really good report about this trend of more private sector involvement in public delivery of highway projects. And as you can see, there's been a big shift in the growth of outsourcing and delivery of projects. Why is this happening? The Highway Trust Fund has become a less reliable source of funding, and in the last few years, public-private partnership investment in the U.S. transportation sector has really increased from its historical levels. These investments provide certainty where our Highway Trust Fund is not seen as providing that certainty. It provides money now at the cost of financing over a period of years, often through tolls. So the federal government is involved in P3s. The USD has the Office of Innovative Program Delivery at FHWA, and they give technical assistance, spread best practices, and have model contracts in addition to providing a range of different financing options. And they do that both for existing facilities and new facilities. This webinar will focus on new facilities. And so what does this all mean for bicycling and walking? Well, public-private partnerships are an opportunity to build things. They can build highways, they can build transit. They generally rely on toll revenue to get back the money that builds them. And this means that when we have these facilities being built, it's very important that biking and walking facilities are included up front, that when we have a contract request to the private sector, that biking and walking facilities are included in that request so that it is built when the facility is built. The potential problems of public-private partnerships can be that they are usually building these very large facilities which may encourage more car-oriented development. There are certain contract clauses that may prevent future development of alternatives that might cut into the revenue stream of that public-private partnership. And there's the possibility of future financial liabilities depending on how the contract is developed. So I will now turn it over to our presenters to give more background on public-private partnerships for transportation. So, Donald.
I don't see it. Are you seeing my grandson?
I am, I believe.
I don't know how to. Hold on, everybody. I'm trying to find. Shouldn't I have? Oh, I should have the PowerPoint up. No,
yeah, you should.
Oh. Do you have it? Actually, here, hold on.
Yeah.
Sorry. Take me off the screen so I can just do this. It'll take a second. I didn't understand the instructions.
Sorry.
1 second. Oh, okay, put me back on. I'm there.
Okay, so we'll go back to Donald and begin his presentation now.
It was my son's 3rd birthday party this weekend. So you all got to cancel the cutest child in the world. Let me go over. So I'm going to talk very brief. You know, we have a number of speakers. I'm going to talk pretty briefly, sort of big picture stuff about public interest. The title here is Public Interest Protections in P3s, Public-Private Partnerships for short, in legislation and specific projects. And so I am working to move my arrow, and it's not working, Ken. All right, how's that? You see that, the agenda? Okay, so just real quick, I'm going to go over 3 things. P3 101 in 60 seconds, and Ken just gave a pretty good technical description of P3s. I think is really helpful. The second thing I want to do is what can go wrong, and give you a cautionary tale about a P3 that has, by all accounts and by all who's looked at it, has been a disaster. But it provides a lot of illustration for the kinds of things you want to do going forward. So that's the next piece is, you know, what do we do to make it right? And I'm going to talk about principles there. Okay, so P3 101, real in 60 seconds. So the question at the top is, why should we, P3's, at its heart is about attracting private capital to meet public needs. So the question at the top is, says, why would we use private money to build infrastructure when public dollars are so cheap? You can buy or build a house right now at 3.5% interest, and private money has a far greater return, need for return on investment, 10, 12, 15%. So why would we do that? And the answer is really sort of two or threefold. This is basic stuff. One is there is massive need. The Association of Civil Engineers estimates $3.6 trillion in deferred infrastructure needs for the country. I'll give you a couple of examples. 1 in 9 of the nation's bridges are structurally deficient. 42% of America's major urban highways remain congested, costing the economy $101 billion in wasted time and fuel annually. The average age of the country's 84,000 dams is 52 years old. And then significantly for this webinar, almost half of American households lack any access to transit, and millions face irregular and undependable service that doesn't stop near their home or workplace. So there is absolutely massive need. Second point, of course, is that we could theoretically go get public money and do that, and it would be the cheapest way to pay it back, but we have real limits on the availability of public money, and they're primarily political resistance to tolls and taxes, but there are also financial limits. If a public agency has maxed out their bonding capacity, that's another kind of limit as well. So that's very real. So the solution then is we need to pay more for private money, and we should do that when appropriate. But we want to make sure that the contracts have very strong protections, because if we're going to pay more, we want to make sure we get more. So let me go next to the cautionary tale, where we can kind of make some of this very real. Okay. So I'm going to tell you the story. Some of you may know this. I don't know where folks are from, but this is and this is a brownfield. This is the sale of an existing asset, even though the focus of this webinar is new assets, new infrastructure. But again, it's just a great illustration. So 3-4 years ago, the city, Mayor Daley and the city of Chicago came in with a proposal to set from a consortium of Morgan Stanley, a sovereign wealth fund from Abu Dhabi, and a national company called Alliance Capital Partners. And on a Friday, he said, "I've got to the city council, I've got a deal. We can have $1.1 billion up front in exchange for selling, leasing, but selling or really long-term lease, all control of all of the city's 36,000 parking meters to this consortium for the next 75 years. So, and then the city council had to vote on that Tuesday. I suppose that's how things work in Chicago. So after the fact, so they and this was at a time when the city's bleeding red ink. They're desperate. Do you want the $1.1 billion? Do you not? They took the deal. So here's what's happened after. When the analysis was done after the fact, again, there was no public participation before the fact, no independent analysis, but there were a set of analyses afterwards. The Inspector General, Chicago Inspector General, did a look and decided that even if you wanted to securitize your parking meters for that long, it's just another creative way to borrow money or to attract capital, the city sold $1 billion too cheaply. They could have got $1 billion more. They got taken on the financial. But even what I believe is more, and these are some of the headlines that you could Google it, and the headlines go on for pages. There is no one in Chicago that doesn't hate this deal. And so, but here's what's worse about these deals, again, it's instructive. In the contract, there are things called, there are clauses that Ken kind of alluded to called non-compete clauses or compensation clauses. So now the city, anytime they want to hold a street fair and close off the streets for the weekend, have to pay make the private operators whole. They have to pay for it. If they want to remove a spot in front of a dry cleaner, to either find a new spot, and if they can't do that, they have to buy out the future value of that spot. We worked with a professor at Roosevelt University there who interviewed a number of transportation planners and found that it was beginning to affect the ability to do new BRT routes, because they either, to do them, you either had to pay the private operators for the lost meters, or you had to find new meters, and they kind of had done as much as they could do there. Same thing with bike lanes, same thing with other kind of traffic management things. Everything they do that affects materially the operators, they need to be made whole. And from our perspective, that really affects democracy and our ability to do public policy. If things cost money, then you often just say, well, never mind. We can't afford it. So then the question is, this is really broad brush, and we have, Ken has some tools, and we also have tools, and you can look on our website as well for other sort of to drill down deeper into the weeds. But so here's what we think are some of the essential P3 principles, because the devil truly is in the details. These are long-term contracts that need to be written extraordinarily well, negotiated really tough from the public side. So one is, the first one, prudent financial analysis based on realistic projections. Some of you may have seen the news that the Indiana toll road that was sold a few years ago to Macquarie and some others just filed for bankruptcy this weekend, I think a couple nights ago. The projections were way off in terms of the traffic. And their deals are a bit dependent on cars being on the road. The second, you want to make sure that the contracts don't undermine public interest, don't have non-compete clauses. There are road deals around the country that make it, with non-compete clauses that make it difficult to build mass transit, because that would, again, materially impact in a negative way the private investors. You want public control of all policy decisions, that what projects get chosen should be based on the transportation needs, not just which are the most profitable, which has generated the return, because that could also drive public money towards some projects and away from projects in urban areas that don't have the resources that, but still urgently needed. Full transparency and public participation is essential in these deals. Robust oversight and accountability. They're contracts. There's and they need to be looked at and maintained and administered throughout the life. And then we believe, really important, that public infrastructure. We're talking about trillions of dollars. It is one of the greatest job creators in the in the country, and we should be overtly working to rebuild the middle class while we rebuild our infrastructure that create family-supporting jobs and careers for both construction and operation of our transit system, of our roads, of our bridges, of our public buildings, and all of that. So that then this adds up to us as a win-win-win deal. The last win being it's good enough for investors to want to make an adequate rate of return, and that's the only way this works. I believe that's my last slide. That's our website and my email.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Donald. And really, in the public interest has great resources on public-private partnerships and privatization in general. So they're a great place to check out. And I will get it to our next presenter, who is Jim Reed from the National Conference on State Legislatures.
Great. Well, thank you, Ken. I think you and Donald teed up the issue really well. So I'm going to talk about legislative provisions that act to protect the public interest. And there are 33 states and Puerto Rico that have done this. NCSL is the organization that works for all 50 state legislatures and the territorial legislatures. We work with all 7,300 state legislators and legislative staff on a whole variety of issues. And we had a working group look into this a few years back and develop some principles out of that, and I'll share that as I go along here. So I won't dwell on this. The two previous speakers have talked about what PPPs or P3s are. Basically, from Federal Highway Administration's point of view, it's an opportunity for more involvement on the private sector side. I think what we've seen of late and is also not only the design, construction, and operation and maintenance, but also financial contribution. There's a whole spectrum of types of P3s that cover a whole variety of the really A to Z elements of getting a project completed, and those are negotiated depending on the particular deal. I think it's important to point out that really virtually all the P3s we're talking about, where the public sector retains ownership. It's not a situation where a public asset is sold and becomes a private asset. It is privately operated for a period of time, but it always is retained in ownership by the private sector. This is the map showing the states. I mentioned 33 states plus Puerto Rico having having some kind of enabling legislation. So you can see the darker colored states there are those that have a relatively broad statute that enables a framework of a program of public-private partnerships, often implementing a public-private partnerships office within, say, a Department of Transportation. The lighter colored blue there are states that limit their legislation either to specific projects or limit it in other ways. And then the states in white have no current legislation as of this date in 2014. This is the cover of our toolkit that we put together with that working group I mentioned. If you Google this title, you'll find it online, and I would recommend it to you. As far as being a balanced, let me go to the next slide. Our goal was to put together a nonpartisan, balanced overview of materials that would help state legislators look at P3 decision making, both sort of at the stage of developing legislation and also then in terms of looking at particular P3s. And so we brought together a bipartisan group of state legislators from around the country, some legislative staff. We also had some companies involved. We had some organizations, labor unions, and we had some environmental groups and some others, some trade groups involved. So we got a nice balance of opinions and came up with, I think, some good recommendations and guidance, and I'll talk about a couple of those. But wanted to look at the context for understanding P3s, what the state government role was, legislative, executive, so forth, and then some principles for good governance. It did focus on roadways primarily, but in that context, and we'll hear more about US 36, there's a lot of other elements that can be added into corridors that are being developed for transportation purposes. This did come out almost 4 years ago. It retains its currency to this day. We've done regular updates of the legislative piece because more states have passed it, but in terms of the principles and the kind of the overall context, it's still current. Quickly, a couple of assumptions. We start from the assumption that states are really in the best position to do public-private partnerships. Secondly, that if that's going to happen in a particular state, and let me just say, NCSL as an organization really supports a broad toolkit of funding and financing opportunities that states might want to pursue in transportation. We are not saying P3s is the answer. It is possibly a tool you might use for larger projects. So our idea is we'll put some guidance out there, but we're not in any way, shape, or form telling any particular state to go this way or not. And that kind of gets to the third point there. And what we have put together, what we've for those states that wish to consider it, what we ask is, or what we put forward, that protection of the public interest is paramount, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The point there on the last bullet is that P3s don't create new money. They create financing from private entities, but that private money is paid back over time in some form or fashion with public money, whether it's tolls, if it's a toll P3, or through other means, existing taxes and so forth that might be made through the availability payments, where as the project becomes available in stages or at the end, payments are made. So this was touched on a bit by Donald, talking about, approvals and having the public policy control be retained in the public. And so legislative approval is out there in a number of states. And so here's a listing of the states that have some sort of a legislative approval, and I'll go into a little more specificity on these. So 8 states have legislative approval, meaning a committee or a legislative body signs off on a P3. A couple states do it in particular circumstances, for instance, in Utah and Puerto Rico, to convert an existing facility to a toll road, which was the case that Donald mentioned with Indiana. And Indiana did have legislative approval until 2011, and they've repealed it since then. And then other states have a review or involvement, but not approval. And let me put up a map that kind of gives you a sense of that. So the dark blue, those are the states that require some kind of legislative approval. I mentioned the Utah and Puerto Rico. And then the states crosshatched in blue there have legislative input, involvement, review, but not approval. One of the issues with approval by a legislative body that the private sector has raised is that it can bring uncertainty into the process, particularly if it's a kind of end of the day approval of a contract. So the more ideal situation from their point of view would be to have a legislative framework, legislative input along the way, but then authority to negotiate a contract is given to an agency that then can do that in a manner that allows that to happen. So in terms of a few of the details on legislative approval, in Florida and Tennessee, it's approved through the appropriations process. In Florida, if it's a lease of an existing tollway, it goes through the Legislative Budget Commission. In Maine, there has to be a specific bill passed to authorize a P3 agreement if it goes over 50 years. In Missouri, there's a joint committee on transportation oversight that looks at these proposals. It's made up of legislative members. North Carolina, if they have 5 designated in statute, if it goes beyond that, it requires legislative approval in terms of a new bill. In Delaware, there's a joint bond bill committee that the co-chairs would need to approve of any P3 in that state. And then in Washington, if there's going to be a tolling project, the legislature would approve it. And then in West Virginia, also a concurrent resolution would need to be passed in order for a P3 to proceed. And these are generally, earlier in the process. They're generally not at the end of the process in terms of a contract being finalized. It's more kind of an authorization to go forward. So one of the other issues was, and Donald brought this up too, that again, the public sector kind of runs this as opposed to more private control. And one of the ways this is done is to ensure that projects like this are part of an existing state or local transportation plan. So these 12 states specifically require that. And some other states have other provisions that allow for unsolicited proposals to come in. Sometimes those need to be part of an existing plan, or other times they're considered without reference to an existing plan. But this is a way to keep more control in the public sector. Non-compete was brought up. So a number of states, and this has become an issue over time, in some of the earlier P3s, non-compete was more, having a non-compete clause was more common. In some of the more recent agreements, the non-compete clauses have been either taken out or they're limited so that the public sector does not get hamstrung or restricted in a way that damages the public interest in terms of developing alternative transportation routes in that corridor or in that area. So I mentioned our toolkit and showed you the cover of that. One of the things the group considered was to really look at the public interest for all the stakeholders and take a 360 view. And so there's some guidance in there on how to do that. And I've talked about some of those already, so I won't go into this in great detail. There is the second to last bullet there talks about comparing P3s to traditional project delivery, and there are some methodologies, public sector comparator and/or value for money, where projects are looked at through a couple of different lenses. You know, all public money and public provision versus some involvement on the private side, and those studies can then help the agency and the legislature and other decision-making bodies determine whether it's in the public interest or not. Principle 4, you know, education and involvement is important. That was mentioned as a, you know, one of the tools to really ensure that public interest is not is fully accounted for. So debate, explanation, education. I know we'll maybe hear a little bit about that in terms of the US 36 project. Accountability, transparency. Some of the best practices that have been put out there by some other groups have to do with putting the contract online, creating a plain language explanation of what's going on, and some things like that. The long-term perspective is important. You know, the disastrous case that was brought up by Donald, it seemed like it was driven by some short-term concerns about revenue. Really, the long-term is where to look, because these are long-term arrangements. 50 years in many cases. The last one I wanted to talk about was, and I mentioned it, comprehensive project analysis. Really look at the alternatives. There's some best practices out there in the international sector, and some tools have been developed by Federal Highway that would help states do that. So when these kind of methodologies are employed, chances of it being in the public interest are higher, because alternatives are examined. So that's where I'll leave it. Here's my contact information, and I look forward to the questions from the group. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. The National Conference of State Legislatures really has some great resources. It's really interesting how kind of contract terms and legislative, I guess, approval and all that stuff has changed over time as people have gotten more experience with public-private partnerships in the U.S.
Yes.
Do I give it? So now we're going to go to Will's presentation, which you can start at any time, Will.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
It's a little quiet, so either turn volume up or speak louder, I guess.
How's that? Better?
That's better.
Okay, great. Well, hi everybody. My name is Will Kerns, and I am with US 36 Commuting Solutions, and I'm here to talk to you today about public-private partnerships on the US 36 corridor, and specifically how that relates to bicycle infrastructure. You guys have been hearing a lot about the funding mechanisms and how it relates to the sort of roadway infrastructure. But what I want to do is talk to you guys a little bit about how to tie in bicycling into the public-private partnership financing mechanism. Another thing I just want to mention before I get into the presentation is that Colorado has decided on a new policy that states that all new roadway capacity will be tolled. So Colorado isn't in the business of building new general purpose lanes anymore. Any new roadway capacity will be tolled, which really opens up really sets the stage and opens up the door to more public-private partnerships, because toll lanes are pretty ideal for private companies to design, build, operate, finance, and maintain potentially. Okay, next slide, please. US 36 corridor, a little background, runs between Denver and Boulder, Colorado. It's a heavily used commuting corridor, and both bi-directional. So we have people starting in Denver and commuting to their jobs in Boulder. We also have people living in Boulder and commuting to their jobs in Denver. So it's a busy corridor. We have lots of technology-oriented businesses, corporations on the corridor. So it's a good hub for jobs. But with those jobs, we've had some congestion problems and some other issues in the past few years. So I have been working on this corridor in one way or another, on and off, for the past 10 years, doing an environmental impact statement and figuring out exactly kind of what we're going to do for this corridor to remedy some of the traffic congestion that we've had. And one of our main points of focus in the new build package is to make it multimodal, make it accommodate transit, make it accommodate HOV, carpool type vehicles, have it accommodate bikes and peds, and as well as looking at a rail project that unfortunately is delayed until about 2040. But for the most part, working with the transit agencies such as RTD, CDOT, which is the Colorado Department of Transportation, and then all the local governments along the corridor, the local counties and the local municipalities, to build consensus on what we're going to do to build this corridor out and to make a wise investment of our public funds. What we came up with is new express lanes and a bus rapid transit system that uses the express lanes. These express lanes are going to start out as 2+ initially for the first year, but then they're going to get bumped up to 3+. Now these express lanes are HOT lanes, so potentially people in a single occupancy vehicle or people in a 2-person carpool are allowed to drive in the lane, but they're going to be paying a variable toll that is set on the price of congestion of the surrounding general purpose lanes. Keep in mind, this is just one lane in each direction, and this project also builds 2 general purpose lanes, which currently exist on the corridor. We're not taking those away. We're gonna leave those, but we're gonna make express lanes that are priced based on the level of congestion in the general purpose lanes. So if you have a traffic jam in the general purpose lanes, you might expect to see a $7 or $8 toll to use the express lanes, but they will be available to you. We're reconstructing 6 bridges and interchanges along the corridor. This is absolutely necessary because we're going to be putting in some slip ramps for BRT access on certain interchanges to make it easier and more efficient for the bus rapid transit vehicles to operate. And then most importantly, I think why most of the people are on this call is the construction of the US 36 bikeway. So this is a 12-foot multi-use path connecting Boulder to Denver. And this is a path that we are very proud of, and I'm going to talk more about it over the next slides. But I just wanted to say that doing this P3 is one of the first transportation P3s for the state, and it's basically allowing us to build this project 20 years ahead of when we normally could have afforded it using public tax money, which is why we kind of settled on it as part of the build package, is that it just made a lot of sense for us to do it this way, and as long as we had the correct contract in place and the correct contractor, that we could get this project done and going and improve the lives of the people that use this corridor every day. So next slide. Okay, how do you get bicycle improvements included into a P3 build package? So getting down to the brass tacks of this is we include bicycle improvements were part of our initial vision. So we included them into our initial host of alternatives that we looked at very early in the process. Basically, we have a great bike system in Colorado, and especially in this sort of northwest Denver Boulder region. However, we were missing kind of the key critical link to link all of the bicycle infrastructure together, linking the paths with the municipalities, with the bike lanes, and with the existing trail system. And that was this US 36 bikeway. So including that into the process early, including your bicycle infrastructure and all your wildest bicycle hopes and dreams early on is absolutely critical. We used the multimodal improvements and the bicycle improvements to advance the goals of the project. We initially had a project goal of a multimodal corridor between Denver and Boulder, and we used these improvements to advance those goals. Okay, and then, you know, this bikeway is seen as an important asset to our region. Basically, everybody was in consensus that we wanted a bikeway built as part of this project, so it was included. Next slide. This is our US 36 project area. As you can see, Denver to Boulder, with interchange reconstruction in Louisville, Broomfield, and Westminster along the way. We had also included a northwest rail line that would go from Denver roughly just north of the corridor but parallel to Boulder, and then the vision was to eventually get it to Longmont. We ran into some problems with the rail line because we were dealing with the freight lines and using some of their right-of-way, which can be notoriously difficult to deal with. So the rail line got pushed off, but what we got instead was we got a great BRT system that's coming along, and we've got this great bikeway as well as the express lanes. Okay, next. Okay, so this is our 36 bikeway map. As you can see, the bikeway follows the corridor generally on the south side. There were a few parts of the corridor where we had to jump over to the north side, but generally we wanted the bikeway to be mostly along the south side of the corridor for reasons like southern exposure to the south winter sun, to keep the bikeway melted and keep ice off of it in the winter. But as you can see, it begins in Boulder, ends in actually technically Westminster. It runs down a road called Bradburn, which would connect to the Little Dry Creek Trail, which eventually ends in the Denver Trail system. So this bikeway is going to be great. It's kind of the last missing link for us, and that's all I have to say about this. Next slide. Okay, next slide. Okay, and I think at this point I can open it up to comments or questions. And I just wanted to thank the League of American Bicyclists and everyone for listening.
Thank you, Will. That was great. It's a really exciting project and a great bikeway for the communities around Denver and Boulder. I kind of wonder how much of a role did the multimodalness of the project kind of help with community buy-in? Was that the big selling point and the public talking point for the project?
Yeah, I think it really helped us because Boulder is a very transit and bicycle oriented town. Denver is bicycle oriented and becoming more and more transit oriented. So having this multimodal aspect of this corridor absolutely helped us to sell it to the public and get people to buy in on it.
That's awesome. I've got a question for Jim Reed. For kind of people across the country, is there a great place to find their state's legislative approvals of P3 projects, or when these things are going to the legislature?
Yeah, Jim Reed here. We keep a database of current legislation in transportation, funding, and finance, and one of the categories is public-private partnerships. So to the extent that there is a bill that's being considered, we would have that in there in pretty much real time, maybe with a 10-day, possibly a 10-day lag. We do a 2-week update, but so that's one avenue, and you could Google NCSL Transportation Database, and you'll get it. It's one of the first things that'll come up with that search. We do not keep track necessarily of some of the other activities that wouldn't have resulted in some kind of bill being introduced, but that'd be a good place for your members to go to take a look at that.
Okay, great. And I've got another one for Jim, but I could also see Donald having something to say about it. One of our listeners wants to know more about enabling legislation and why you need enabling legislation, and kind of what the pros and cons are between, I guess, broad enabling legislation or legislation that's perhaps more prescriptive.
Well, I can give my perspective, and then would certainly welcome Donald as well. What we heard when we did our study, and we talked to a lot of experts in the field, as well as a lot of legislators and industry folks, kind of across the board, and the notion, I guess, the consensus was that you really need a good, strong rule book, or you just need a framework that everyone understands and everyone can abide by. So that's the essential foundation, I suppose. As far as broad versus more narrow, what we've seen is that states that aren't sure about taking the approach may start with a narrow designation of a particular project, say, and just see how that goes. In the case of Texas, they do have a pretty robust program, but they've limited the number of projects that can be considered to about a dozen. So at this point, other states have sort of bought in, maybe have seen it happen well in other places, or they just have more of a comfort level, and they've said, we're going to create a broad framework that allows for, a variety of ideas and proposals to come forward. But I think the key is that everyone has, and then implementing regulations would be associated with legislation to that the agency that's designated to do it would fill in the blanks in terms of the implementation. But what we've heard and what our members, being lawmakers, like to see is, just a solid framework that everyone knows, what the rules of the game are, so to speak.
Yeah, and Ms. Donald, I guess I would add, I mean, that's certainly true for everybody. So I guess I would add that the importance of enabling legislation is that, these really are the constitutional, as it were, policy document that allows, the state legislature to make a whole set of initial decisions about what it sees for infrastructure in the state. And that's number one. Number two is that, it's not just about doing deals or building roads. You do want to be able to integrate economic development and climate and transportation policy, and so you really want some policy guidance to make sure that everything isn't just deal by deal, because in what we find in deal by deal, it's the dollars are enticing. So you really do need guidance and policy direction to make sure that everybody, but not just the rules of how it should happen, but also so everybody knows what the goal is.
Yeah, that sounds, it's really important to have kind of a rule book that everyone can reference as they're going into these projects and have principles, not just chase money. We've got a question. If anybody has ever heard of the suggestion of building a standalone bike project as a public-private partnership. I know I've seen kind of historical toll road for bikes that was in early Los Angeles in the early 1900s. And I know there are certainly more community development things that involve building bicycle infrastructure. But I guess, has anyone heard of a tolled standalone bike project?
Well, other than the city bikes in New York and each city, number of cities now have, I don't know what they call them,
Bike share.
bike share programs. Because you have to have a revenue stream, and the fact that they're becoming so popular so quickly is, says that that's private money that invests to make that happen. But it's not. I don't think the question. It's not to the point of the question, but it is a way to generate the revenue to pay, to pay off the capital costs.
And I just want to say that I have not heard of anything sort of PPP related that funds a specific bicycle infrastructure project like a path or a bike trail. However, that isn't to say that we can't get creative and find something in the future. Here's the thing: on US 36, the capital generating mechanism that attracted the private sector is the express lanes. The express lanes have the ability to generate revenue and potentially make a profit for a concessionaire, a private concessionaire. A bike facility is not necessarily conducive to generating a lot of revenue. However, who knows? I mean, maybe we could get creative and make something work on a smaller scale, but I haven't seen anything personally.
Well, and I think what US 36 does show is that more and more folks around the country that advocacy groups and bike advocacy groups and transit groups should in fact be pushing hard to get bike lanes into the deals, because they're being subsidized by the like you said, the transit lanes, and that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. And so it's a really good model that should be advocated around the country.
Jim Reed here. Yeah, I've not heard of a P3 that's specific to bicycle. I think their projects are probably too small. One of the numbers I've heard thrown out is that a P3 probably needs to be at least of a scale of about $200 million project to make it, attractive and worthwhile for all the all the machinations that need to take place for that to happen. That being said, maybe it's not a P3, but maybe there is private sector participation to sponsor, facilities along the way. A rest stop for cyclists to get water or whatever it might be. We've seen that with rest stops for highways. Those are often sponsored by private sector, and so there's opportunities like that.
Okay. I've got a question for Will. Kind of, you have this great project with all these cool multimodal features. So then what was the process to determine the right contractor for that project?
Well, we sent it out to bid, so of course, not anyone's going to be able to bid on a project of this magnitude. So we had a few bids come in from a few different kind of conglomerations. Usually what ends up happening is a couple of companies join together to team up on a project of this magnitude. So that's what happened with us, and we went through a process of interviewing and looking at the proposals as well as just who we know, who knows the area, and how familiar they are, and we picked the concessionaire based on kind of some criteria that we all came up with. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Just making sure that all the features are in the plans, and then putting it out to bid and making sure the process is competitive.
Yep, absolutely.
We've got a few more minutes here for any last questions. I'm going to give another plug to our Big Ideas grants. If you're an advocate at the state and local level and you're doing a campaign that is focused on getting money for biking and walking infrastructure or programs centered around equity, safety, or Vision Zero, health, or walking, and innovative sources of money, we want to get your requests for money, and perhaps you will be awarded a $10,000 grant for your campaign. So we encourage you to get out there and be innovative and go after some big ideas and some big funding opportunities. And if there are any more questions, let me know. One last call. Otherwise, I'd like to thank our presenters today. They did an excellent job. I know this is a new subject for me, and hopefully it's new for some of you too. I think it's an interesting development in how our transportation system is being funded, and it's important that we as bicycling and walking advocates are knowledgeable about it and can be involved. So thank you all for attending today.
Thanks,
all
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.